Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to the channel. My name is Mitch. I make videos about photography and filmmaking. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the best settings, or the settings that I think are most important to change when you first step into the world of Fujifilm cameras. So whether you're an established photographer who's just made the switch over to Fuji, or if it's your first serious camera, this video should hopefully be helpful. Now in this video, I'm going to be covering settings that are shared across most Fujifilm cameras from the last 4 or 5 years, so you should be able to find them regardless of your camera model. Getting your focus right is really important. Of course, you want your images to be in focus. But I think the next most important thing down from there is making sure that your camera is intuitive and quick to use. So you want to be able to get focus really quickly and not have to fiddle around with settings. So in this part of the video, we're going to be focusing on the AF/MF part of the menu. So if you haven't already, navigate to that tab in the menu in your camera right now. Okay, so here we are in the X-T5 menu, and don't worry if you've got a different Fujifilm camera, the menu should be fairly similar. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to AF mode here, and you'll see that it is currently set to single point. So what we want to do is set this to wide/tracking, and then the second thing that we want to make sure that we've done is change our focus mode from single to continuous. Now how you do that, usually there is a switch either on the side or the front of your camera. On the X-T5 it's on the front. So as you can see here, our switch is set to C for continuous. So now what this is going to allow us to do is use our center point here as a tracking autofocus point. So in single, you would have to move this box around the frame to select the area of focus that you wanted the camera to focus on. And instead now what we're going to do is just leave this point in the center, and then we're going to place this box over whatever we want to focus on, half press our shutter to engage the autofocus, and then just simply recompose our shot to however you want to compose your photo, and then take the image. And this is going to track that object or the area of the frame as you recompose your photo. So this is so much quicker than moving that autofocus around, particularly when a subject is moving maybe back and forth through the frame or towards you. You don't have to keep moving your autofocus point. You can simply half press the shutter and it's going to continually track that subject. Now that we've set that up, let's go back into the menu, and we're going to go down to the second page here and find the face and eye detection. And I'm actually going to turn this on, and we're going to use eye auto. Now, the reason that I don't use eye off is because that will just track the face itself. And what can happen sometimes is it will focus on the eyebrows or the nose rather than the eyes themselves. So if you've got a very close-up shot, you definitely want to be focusing on the eyes. That is generally what we want to see in focus. And you've got the option here of doing right eye or left eye. So I don't typically use these unless I'm very specific about what I want to be photographing and which eye I want to be focusing on. If you select eye auto, it should focus on the eye that's closest to the camera, and that's generally what we want. So that is the setting that I'm going to be selecting. Now, if there is no face in the frame, it's going to revert back just to that center point that I was showing you before, and then you would just place the box over whatever the subject is that you wanted to track, and it will track that. So this is a really great hybrid setup when you're sometimes photographing people, sometimes not, which is generally what I'm doing, a mixture of the two. It just means you're super flexible and you generally don't need to touch any settings while you're shooting. Back to the menu now, and we're going to go back up here to the AFC custom settings. Now, as you can see in this menu, it gives you a bunch of different scenarios that you might run into while you're photographing. And this is really going to be personal preference and up to the type of photography that you're doing. So for example here, setting number 5 for moving and accelerating, decelerating subjects. So if you know that you're going to be shooting in this kind of situation, you might experiment with this and try it out. Generally, I'm just using multi-purpose. I've found that over the years, this has really worked super well for me, and I haven't really found any situations where I'm struggling to get autofocus. So multi-purpose does a great job, but I would recommend, just experimenting with these different situations just to see what works for you and the type of photography that you do. Now, another thing that I will change is actually down on the second page here, which is the AF illuminator. So I think by default, this is switched on, and this is essentially just like a little lamp in the front of your camera that will light up, and it'll help you to get autofocus in darker situations. Now, the reason that I keep this off is because I don't want this always lighting up, because it can draw unwanted attention to you. So you don't always want to draw attention to yourself, particularly when you're doing street photography or you're trying to be super candid. So I will only switch this on when I really need it in a super dark situation. So if you're like me and you want to stay under the radar, I would suggest having this off. Then if we go down here to subject detection, you can actually change the subjects that you are trying to track. So it has a bunch of different options here, from animals, birds, cars, bikes, planes, trains. To be honest, I've never really messed around with any of these settings. But then again, I'm not really a wildlife photographer or an automotive photographer. So if you do shoot a lot of cars, for example, maybe choosing this option would be a good setting for you to try out. I just leave it on animal or just off altogether. But again, it's going to be up to you and what you shoot. In this part of the video, I'm going to be talking about how the images on your camera actually look. And this is one of the cool parts about Fujifilm cameras, is they actually have some nice stylistic options that you can choose in the menu to make your photos look interesting and different. You can also edit your photos after the fact and make them look pretty much however you want. But I think that choosing a profile in the camera is still important, even if you decide to do this, because it's the photo that you're going to be looking at to make sure that you've got everything right. And also, if you happen to be shooting photos of a friend or maybe even a professional client, you want those photos to look presentable on the screen. So I'm going to be explaining all of the film simulations one by one and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Most of this is my own opinion, so I think it is important to experiment for yourself and find out what you like. But let's jump into the film simulations. So for film simulations, we're going to be in the IQ menu, and just coming down to film simulation here, I'm going to scroll all the way to the top, and we're going to start with Provia. So this is a very standard, very neutral profile if you don't want anything overly stylistic and you want the image to look true to life, very accurate to the colors that you're seeing with your own eyes. Provia is very neutral, and the skin tones are a little pinker than some of the other profiles. It's a very neutral profile, has very neutral skin tones, so it's great for portraits, and I love Provia. I've used it many times in the past, and it's just a great profile. Next up is Velvia, and as the name suggests, it's a vivid profile, so it has very high saturation. The cool thing about this is that it actually has quite a nice color palette to it. So if you wanted to, you could turn the saturation all the way down in the menu, and Velvia ends up being quite a nice profile. But as standard, it's a little bit too oversaturated for my liking. Maybe if you're taking photos of a sunset or a landscape, Velvia might be a really good choice, but it's not as versatile as some of the other film simulations here. So next up is Astia, and this has to be my favorite film simulation out of all of them. It just has a really neutral but very warm look, and it's just super soft and super pleasing to the eye. I really love Astia because it works in almost any situation, and it's not overly stylized, but it also has a very rich, approachable, very nice look to it, which I absolutely love. So next up is Classic Chrome, and now we're getting into the more stylistic film simulations in the Fuji camera. This one has a quite desaturated look, particularly in the skin tones. Skin tones also lean a little bit more towards the pink side, and this is very reminiscent of vintage film. For me, it's just a little bit too stylized. Obviously, you can go and add some saturation back and, tweak the colors a little bit. But for me, it's not my favorite. I'm a bit of a contrarian in this kind of area because Classic Chrome is probably one of the most, if not the most popular film simulation. All right, so moving down to Reala Ace. Now, this is one that was actually added not too long ago, I believe. So if there are any here that you don't have, this will probably be one of them. And to be honest, I haven't had much experience with Reala Ace in the past, although I do know that a lot of people really like it. It's again very neutral. It's probably most similar to the next two film simulations that we'll go over in the list. I'd love to say more about this one, but I just haven't had too much experience. So let's move on to the next one, which is Pro Neg High. And this is another favorite of mine. It does kind of lean into that film look a little bit, but without being, overly heavy-handed like Classic Chrome is in some situations. Pro Neg High has a film look, but it's kind of very neutral, very subdued, not much saturation, not much contrast going on there. So it is a really nice base, I think, to build some really nice film simulations off. And then if we go to the next one, so this is Pro Negative Standard, and this one is basically the same as Pro Neg High, but just with a little bit less contrast and a little bit less saturation overall. So it is quite flat, which means that you can customize it even more than Pro Neg High. This one for me is a little too flat, but for a lot of people, this could be a really nice versatile film simulation. Okay, so next up, this is probably the most stylized of the bunch in terms of film simulations. So Classic Negative does have a very distinct look. It has these really bluish kind of desaturated greens, a very strong pink cast overall, particularly in the shadows as well. It does have quite a vintage look, sort of like a point and shoot. This is a really cool one to play with. Not something that I would particularly take seriously, but it's a cool option if you want something completely different. Okay, next up is Nostalgic Neg, and this is a really cool one. It's very, very warm. It does have a very distinct look to it. It's quite stylized. I don't mind this one. It has a very, 60s, 70s era look to it. This one might be my third or fourth favorite. Not my absolute favorite, but it's pretty cool. Next up, we have Eterna. So this one was sort of brought in as more of like a flat picture profile quite some time ago, before Fuji even introduced their log profile. So I used to use this one to record video, and while not everyone uses it for video, I think that is like the general consensus that it is like a video, like a flat video film simulation. Next up, we have Eterna Bleach Bypass, which is just kind of like a very stylistic kind of version of Eterna. And then we have our Acros, which is the signature black and white. And this is a very beautiful black and white film simulation. You do have access to a couple of different filters. So this will mimic having a yellow filter on top of, when you're shooting black and white film, and then a red filter, a green filter. They just give different tonality to the images. So I do recommend playing around with those if you are into shooting black and white. And then we just have the standard monochrome filter. So this is like a non-stylized black and white, very nice and neutral. And of course you do have your filters as well that you can use with this one. And then we've got sepia. Don't use this. Just don't. So that is all the film simulations. For myself, I'm actually going to be editing all my photos in Lightroom in post-production, but in terms of like an on-camera preview, I'm usually using Astia. If I'm not using Astia, I'll use Provia, and if I'm not using Provia, I'll use maybe Pro Negative High. So it's between those, but I'm definitely going to be using Astia most of the time. I just can't get the exact look that I want straight out of camera. I know a lot of people, they buy Fuji cameras, to get a straight out of camera look that they don't have to edit, but for me, editing is one of the funnest parts of photography, and I really love, getting my exact vision for what I wanted to create. One other thing before we move on is I want to talk briefly about DR, because DR is one of those things that can really affect the look and feel of your images, particularly when you're using film simulations. So a lot of the time you'll have, a really bright background and a really dark foreground or something like that, and it's very hard to capture all of the detail, across a very bright scene. So using DR400 can really help to save the highlights in your photo. So if you're noticing that your skies are blown out, or, very bright or white objects are blown out, you're losing all this detail in those brighter elements in the photos, using one of these DR modes can really help. So DR400 is the one I recommend. Now, this is going to lock you in at ISO 640, but then you're also going to be bringing your highlights down, having a more high dynamic range image overall. This is particularly when you're shooting JPEGs. So I would highly recommend using DR400. You're going to have much nicer, flatter images overall, and you're going to be able to see more detail overall. We've also briefly touched on color. So this is how much saturation that you're going to see in the image. So if you want more color, you'll go into the plus numbers. If you want less color, you'll go into the minus numbers. And then we'll also quickly talk about tone curves. So if you want your highlights to be brought down, so you want the whites and the bright parts of your image to be a little less bright, you can play around with bringing this down, so into the negative. And then the same thing with the shadows. So if you want your shadows to be lifted up, you don't want your shadows to look as dark or as black, then you can actually bring this down. And you can even see how that's affecting the image there. Just on the table here. As you can see, I usually have it set so that the shadows are lifted and the highlights are pulled back. Okay, so now we're going to go over image quality. So if we go to image size here, you'll see that there is a letter as well as some numbers here. So the L or the M, and if I scroll down, you should see S. So you might gather that this is small, medium, and large. That's exactly what it means. So this is the pixel dimensions of the JPEG file that you're going to be saving. This has nothing to do with the RAW, by the way, so it only affects the JPEG. And then those numbers there, that ratio, is essentially your aspect ratio. So a standard aspect ratio is 3:2, and then you've got 16:9, so it's a little bit slimmer, like a video. Then you've got 1:1, so it's pretty much an exact square, 4:3, 5:4. and then we've got those same options in medium. So I will always be using 4:3 and large size. And the reason for this is obviously I want the highest quality, but then also 4:3 is a very versatile aspect ratio. I do shoot some medium format film, which is 4:3 or very, very close to 4:3. So that means that when I'm shooting digital photos on my Fuji and film photos on my medium format camera, the aspect ratios are going to be roughly the same. Now, when you shoot RAW, it's actually going to save the full 2:3 image or 3:2 image, depending on your orientation. So this will only apply to the JPEG. However, when you bring these RAW files into Lightroom, it will have already cropped to 4:3. So when I'm actually shooting here, it's giving me a 4:3, and then there's these little kind of black bars on the side. So it just means that I'm not seeing that extra information, which means that I can crop my photo accurately to a 4:3 image. 4:3 is just my personal preference. Of course, you can play around, see what your personal preference is, whether you like shooting the full sensor at 2:3 or you want to try something like 3:4, totally up to you. Now underneath that we have our image quality. So this is where you would select either shooting RAW, JPEG or RAW plus JPEG. So fine here is the most high quality JPEG. So it has the least compression. Then normal has a little bit of compression. And then we have our RAW, and then fine and raw, normal and raw. So RAW will just be the full resolution, all the information that comes off the sensor, and you can compress that, which I'll talk about in the next section. But for now, I'm just going to use normal and raw. I'm okay with a little bit of compression in my JPEGs. I haven't really seen a big difference. So now we're going to be talking about raw recording and compression. So we've got three options here. We've got uncompressed, lossless compressed, and compressed. So of the three, compressed is going to be the most compressed. So you're going to actually be losing some information from your raw file with this mode. Now, lossless compressed is still a smaller file size, so it is being compressed down, but we're not losing any information. So it's doing it in a non-lossy format. Then we've got uncompressed. So this is going to be the largest file size. Now, this can fill your SD card up a little bit quicker than lossless compressed. And I haven't really seen a massive difference between uncompressed and lossless compressed. So for me, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to be going with lossless compressed. Okay, in this part of the video, we're going to be talking about custom button settings, and every single Fujifilm camera will be slightly different when it comes to the amount of custom buttons that you have and their placement on the camera. So I'll be running through some of the basic settings that I use, as well as some custom button suggestions, and just overall some basic recommendations based on almost 10 years now of shooting on Fujifilm cameras. So now we're down in the setup menu, so the blue wrench down here, and if we go down to the button dial setting, here we can set up some function buttons. So there are buttons all around the camera that allow you to set up different shortcuts. So if you know that you want to be changing your film simulation quite often, you can set it to a certain button. You can turn face and eye tracking on and off with other buttons, and this is completely up to your preference. Of course, you might have a different camera to me, which means you'll have maybe more or sometimes less buttons. But the very, very cool thing about Fujifilm is just look how many options you can set your custom buttons to. It's almost every single item in the menu that you can assign a button to. So it's very, very cool, and something that I am really happy that Fuji have worked very hard on being able to implement into their cameras is just like super customizable buttons. Now, a lot of people really love these dials on top of the camera. As you can see on the right hand side there, we've got our shutter speed dial. On the left hand side, we've got our ISO and then exposure compensation here. And if I had a Fuji lens, you would see an aperture ring here as well, but this is an off-brand lens. Now, while these dials are really cool, I actually prefer using this wheel here on the back and the wheel on the front. And the reason for that is because your hand is already there and you don't really have to look at the number on the wheel or take your eye away from the viewfinder in order to change your settings. So to set these little wheels to change your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, you want to come down here to the command dial setting. Now the X-T5 does give you multiple options, so you can switch this by clicking it in between aperture, exposure comp, and ISO. I generally will change ISO on this front dial, and then on this rear dial here, I'll have this set to my shutter speed, and then I'll just control my aperture on the lens. Now, of course, this is a full manual setup. I've got control over all three settings in the exposure triangle. If you wanted to shoot in all automatic mode, then it's very easy. You just set your shutter speed dial to the A, you set your ISO dial to A here, and then you just set your aperture on your lens to A also. So this will be a fully automatic mode, so the camera is going to choose all the settings for you. If you just wanted to set your shutter speed and have the camera do the rest for you, then you would just simply change this shutter dial. You could set it to whatever you like, or you can set it to T, and then that will assign it to whichever wheel that you've set it to. If you just wanted to shoot in aperture priority, so just letting the camera do everything and then you control the aperture, you would just take the aperture ring off A, set it to whatever you like, and then the camera will do the rest. If you're starting out, I recommend aperture priority, just letting the camera do everything except the aperture, which you will choose yourself. So another cool thing is the quick menu. So most Fuji cameras will have a Q button just like here, and if you click on this, then you will be able to have quick access to a grid of menu options, and these ones I think is a really good idea to set them up as options that you often change. So the way that you would do that is if you go into the menu, and then we're again in the button dial setting just like we were before, and if you go to the edit save quick menu, it will give you the option to change the amount of slots that you want. 16 slots I think is good, gives you the most customizability, and then just switch all of the different settings you want on in this menu. So you can just quickly choose which settings you want to have quick and easy access to, so you can change them here to whatever you like. And this is a really great way to make the camera a lot more usable. And if there are some settings that you change quite frequently, put them in the Q menu. So here is an image on my phone of a photo that I took on my XE5. And when I look at this photo, I generally want it to be looking exactly the same as it does on the back of the camera, because whatever settings and whatever look that I plug into the camera, I hopefully want that to be as close to the final look and feel as possible. Now, of course, your phone and the camera and then your computer, if you've got a MacBook or something like that, are all going to be completely different in the way that they display color. So one of the best recommendations I have when you first get a camera is to use the LCD screen settings to try to get as close as possible to the look of, maybe if it's your phone, that's your main device. So there are some color controls, some brightness controls. Obviously, you're not going to get it to look exactly the same, but this is not really about being scientific about it. It's more about just getting as close as possible so that you only need to make some minor adjustments, whether it's on your phone or on your laptop, in order for it to look how you intended it to look. So we're going to jump into the screen setup area of the menu now, which is the little wrench on the left hand side, and we're going to start playing around with our LCD to match our phone. So here we have the EVF color adjustment. Now, as I mentioned, I do try to sort of do like a crude calibration between my phone and my MacBook screen, and this is for the EVF. So if you look through the viewfinder, I just tweaked that to match as best as possible my phone. So we also have the LCD color, so I've just left this at 0. I must have been happy with the saturation, and then the LCD color adjustment. So I've done -2 red and -3 blue. So obviously I tried to match as close as I could to my phone, and these were the settings that got me close to looking like the phone. Okay, so last up in the screen settings, I want to go down to the display custom setting. Now, all the information on the screen can be a little bit overwhelming, and I know that I only need to see a few things. And so if you go into the display custom setting here you can tick and untick certain options that you might want to see on the screen while you're shooting. So a lot of them is just information that I already know and I don't need to see, or information that I just don't care about at all, like the boost mode. But I do care about frames remaining because I want to know how many photos I can take before my SD card is full. So I would highly recommend setting this up so that you can remove some of that information, because it can get a little bit overwhelming and it can also kind of encroach on your view of your scene and your composition. So that's it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and hopefully using your brand new Fujifilm camera is a little bit easier now. If you are already a Fuji shooter, leave some suggestions down in the comments section below so that we can all learn. I know there's plenty more little hacks that I haven't quite touched on in this video, so maybe I'll make a part 2 with all those suggestions if there are enough of them. Once again, I appreciate you guys for sticking around. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.